Have you ever met someone who, without clear reason, started treating you differently? More distant, colder, or strangely hostile. Perhaps nothing obvious happened, no argument, no betrayal, just a quiet shift, like a light dimming in a room you didn't even know had a switch. At first, you question yourself. Maybe you said something wrong, maybe you changed, but often what's happening has little to do with surface events and everything to do with the invisible psychological mirror that exists between people. Human relationships are not just made of words, gestures, and actions. They are built upon silent reflections, what one person sees, consciously or unconsciously, in another. And this is where the unconscious mirror effect begins its subtle but powerful work. Every individual carries within them a complex landscape of hidden traits, suppressed emotions, unresolved fears, and disarmed desires. These elements don't disappear simply because they're ignored. Instead, they settle into the unconscious, quietly influencing perceptions, reactions, and relationships. When two people meet, their psyches interact on levels far deeper than conversation. Sometimes, without intending to, one person becomes a mirror for the other's unacknowledged aspects. This reflection isn't always flattering. In fact, it often reveals precisely the parts of oneself that have been pushed away, denied, or buried under layers of social masks. Imagine someone who has spent their life denying their insecurity. They've built an image of confidence and control, convincing themselves and others that they are above self-doubt. Now imagine they meet someone who embodies effortless authenticity, someone who walks with quiet self-assurance without trying. Suddenly, a strange feeling arises within them, unease, discomfort, even irritation. Consciously, they may not know why, but unconsciously, your presence has reflected back to them their own hidden insecurity. It's not your confidence that bothers them, it's their disowned insecurity awakening in your presence. The mirror you hold up isn't literal, but psychological, and what they see in it disturbs them. This process is not malicious. It happens involuntarily, beneath awareness. The psyche projects onto others what it cannot tolerate within itself. If someone cannot accept their vulnerability, they may project it onto another and perceive that person as weak. If they cannot face their jealousy, they may accuse someone else of being envious. If they have buried their ambition, they might resent someone who dares to dream boldly. The other person becomes a screen onto which they cast their shadow, a living reminder of what they have chosen to forget. And because facing the shadow is uncomfortable, it's often easier to dislike the mirror than to confront what it reveals. The unconscious mirror effect is especially potent in close relationships. The more emotionally significant someone is, the more their presence has the power to reflect back hidden material. Friends, partners, family members, they all act as psychological mirrors, sometimes showing us beauty, sometimes exposing wounds we'd rather not see. This is why sudden hatred or hostility often emerges not from strangers, but from those who once admired or loved us deeply. In the beginning, admiration may dominate because they focus on the qualities they consciously recognize and value. But as intimacy deepens, the unconscious mirror begins to reveal more than the idealized image, and discomfort grows. Consider how people often idolize someone at first, projecting onto them all the traits they wish to develop in themselves. This idealization feels uplifting, even intoxicating. But eventually, the mirror reveals something else, not only their aspirations, but also their insecurities. When your authenticity mirrors their self-deception, when your courage mirrors their fear, when your calm mirrors their inner chaos, the reflection becomes unbearable. And instead of saying, "This is something inside me I need to face," they may unconsciously decide, "I don't like you anymore." It's not truly you they hate, it's what your presence forces them to confront within themselves. What makes this effect even more intricate is that it often operates silently. The person experiencing the projection rarely articulates their feelings clearly, even to themselves. They might justify their shift in attitude with rationalizations. "You've changed. You're too full of yourself. You make me uncomfortable." But beneath those explanations lies a psychological mechanism at work, one that has been studied, observed, and felt throughout human history. The mirror doesn't lie, but the ego resists looking directly into it. So the mind finds alternative narratives to protect itself from the pain of self-recognition. This unconscious mirroring doesn't only provoke negative reactions, it can also inspire growth. Some individuals, when confronted with their reflection in another, choose introspection over projection. They ask, "Why does this person's presence stir such strong feelings in me?" That question can lead to profound self-discovery, healing, and transformation. But for many, that path is too uncomfortable. Hatred, envy, and resentment become defensive walls, shielding them from their own inner depths. Your presence, therefore, is not the cause, but the trigger, the spark that lights the hidden powder keg of their unresolved inner world. It's important to understand that being someone's mirror doesn't require doing anything extraordinary. Simply being authentic, confident, joyful, or at peace can be enough to reflect back what others have long buried. You might not even be aware of the mirror you hold yet to them. You are the reminder they didn't ask for, the reflection they'd rather not see. And this is why their behavior can shift suddenly, unpredictably, even irrationally. The hatred they feel isn't born in the present moment. It's awakened from the past, from the depths of their unconscious, projected onto the nearest available screen. Envy is one of the most silent yet corrosive emotions that shape human behavior. Unlike anger or fear, it rarely announces itself openly. It hides beneath polite smiles, supportive words, and seemingly innocent gestures. It thrives in the unspoken, in glances that linger too long, in sudden distance, in subtle shifts of tone. Many people imagine envy as something loud and obvious, but in reality, it operates like a quiet shadow, present, powerful, and often denied. The shadow of unresolved envy can alter relationships in ways that feel abrupt, confusing, and painful, especially when it transforms admiration into hostility without warning. At its core, envy arises when someone perceives that another person possesses something they desire but believe they lack, whether it's success, confidence, beauty, love, peace of mind, or inner strength. This feeling is a universal part of the human experience. Everyone has, at some point, felt a pang of envy. But the difference lies in whether that feeling is acknowledged and integrated, or buried and denied. When envy remains unresolved, it doesn't disappear. It sinks into the unconscious, becoming a hidden force that influences how people see and treat those who trigger it. The shadow of envy often forms in the earliest stages of life. Children learn to compare, to measure their worth against siblings, classmates, or friends. When a child feels overlooked or less valued, Envy may quietly root itself in their psyche. If caregivers do not teach healthy ways to process these emotions, the child learns to suppress or disguise them. As the person grows, the envy doesn't vanish. It becomes more sophisticated, hiding behind complex rationalizations and subtle behaviors. What began as a simple emotion transforms into a psychological shadow, a part of the self that is rejected and projected onto others. When this shadow is triggered, it can make someone turn against a person they once admired. Imagine someone who deeply respects your achievements. They cheer for you publicly, praise your efforts, and draw inspiration from your journey. But beneath the surface, a quiet discomfort grows. Your progress is no longer just inspiring, it begins to highlight their own stagnation. Your confidence throws their self-doubt into sharper relief. Your joy reminds them of their dissatisfaction. They may not admit this to themselves because envy contradicts their self-image as supportive and kind. So instead of facing it, the emotion hides deeper where it festers and accumulates intensity. Eventually, this unresolved envy begins to distort their perception of you. They start noticing flaws where they previously saw strengths. They question your motives, attribute negative intentions to your actions, and reinterpret your successes as arrogance or luck. This cognitive shift is not always deliberate. It is the mind's way of protecting itself from the painful feeling of inferiority. If they can convince themselves that you are undeserving or flawed, they can relieve the discomfort envy brings. The easiest way to do this is to lower you in their psychological landscape through subtle criticism, withdrawal, or even outright hostility. This process often happens silently. One day they are warm and encouraging, and the next, something has changed. Perhaps their messages become shorter. Perhaps their enthusiasm fades. Perhaps their compliments feel forced or stop altogether. You may sense the change, but find no clear explanation for it. That's because the shift did not originate in anything you did externally. It began within them, in the shadow of envy they never faced. Your existence became a mirror reflecting their unfulfilled desires, and rather than acknowledging that pain, they redirected it toward you. Unresolved envy doesn't always emerge in grand achievements. It can be triggered by something as simple as emotional stability, authenticity, or self-acceptance. Some people envy not material success, but inner qualities they secretly wish they possessed. Your calmness might highlight their inner turmoil. Your honesty might expose their layers of pretense. Your resilience might remind them of their avoidance. Because these qualities are intangible, the envy they provoke can be even harder for them to recognize or admit. But it still operates with the same psychological force, creating distance and resentment where there was once closeness. Another subtle aspect of unresolved envy is that it often hides beneath excessive praise. People sometimes overcompensate for their envy by idolizing the very person they envy. They may put you on a pedestal, exaggerating your qualities, showering you with admiration. This feels flattering at first, but it is inherently unstable. Pedestals eventually collapse. The moment you act in a way that contradicts their idealized image, or simply continue to succeed in ways that intensify their envy, the emotional tension snaps. The admiration turns sour, the praise fades, and you are left wondering what went wrong. The shadow of unresolved envy is powerful precisely because it's unconscious. Most people don't walk around saying, "I envy this person." Instead, they construct narratives to justify their feelings. They've become arrogant. They were never that talented. They're just lucky. They're changing. These stories are not the real cause. They are defenses. They protect the ego from acknowledging the uncomfortable truth of envy. This is why sudden hatred or coldness can feel so perplexing. It's not based on your behavior, but on the psychological stories their envy forces them to create. Social environments often intensify this shadow. In competitive cultures where comparison is constant, envy thrives in silence. People are taught to hide it, to never admit weakness, to mask their insecurities behind smiles. This creates a collective atmosphere where unresolved envy circulates beneath the surface, shaping alliances, rivalries, and unspoken tensions. In such spaces, those who stand out through talent, authenticity, or inner strength become frequent targets of projected envy. The hostility they encounter is less about who they are and more about what their presence awakens in others' envy. When unresolved, has a unique ability to erode trust and connection. It makes genuine support difficult because the envious person's admiration is mixed with resentment. They may want to be close to you, yet your presence also reminds them of what they lack. This inner conflict creates unstable relationships that can shift suddenly and unpredictably. What begins as inspiration can mutate into criticism. What begins as closeness can transform into distance. And what begins as silent envy can eventually emerge as open hostility. Without clear provocation, idealization is one of the most powerful yet fragile psychological forces that shape human relationships. In the beginning, when people meet someone who captivates them, whether it's through charm, talent, depth, strength, or mystery, they often don't truly see the person as they are. Instead, they see a carefully constructed image, a projection of their own desires, fantasies, and unmet needs. This is the phenomenon of idealization, elevating someone to a symbolic pedestal where they appear almost flawless, extraordinary, and larger than life. It's not an intentional deception, but an unconscious process that allows people to feel inspired, safe, or emotionally fulfilled through the image they create in their minds. The collapse of idealization happens when that projected image begins to crack under the weight of reality. It's not that the person changes suddenly, rather, it's that the idealizer starts to notice details they previously ignored, flaws they filtered out, and complexities they weren't ready to acknowledge. The human mind tends to simplify what it admires, turning complex individuals into symbols. A confident person becomes the one who always knows what to do. A kind person becomes the one who can never hurt me. A talented person becomes the one who will never fail. These narratives are comforting, but they are illusions. And illusions are destined to break. Idealization often begins during moments of personal need or vulnerability. When someone is searching for guidance, love, stability, or inspiration, they are more likely to attach idealized qualities to those who seem to embody what they lack. For example, a person who feels lost might idealize a strong and decisive friend, projecting onto them the role of a savior. Someone who struggles with self-worth might idealize a partner, seeing them as a flawless source of love and validation. In these cases, the idealized figure is not just admired, they are turned into a psychological anchor, a living embodiment of what the admirer craves, but cannot yet cultivate within themselves. But the idealized image is never the full picture. No human being can permanently match the fantasy projected onto them. Over time, as closeness grows, real traits begin to emerge. The decisive friend may reveal uncertainty. The loving partner may show impatience. The admired figure may act in ways that contradict the ideal. These moments, though natural and inevitable, can feel shocking to the person who idealized them. They experience a psychological dissonance. The image they held and the reality they now see cannot coexist peacefully. To resolve this tension, something must give, and usually it's the illusion that collapses first. When idealization collapses, it often feels sudden, even though the process builds gradually beneath awareness. A single comment, a perceived flaw, a human mistake, these can act as the catalyst that shatters the fantasy. The same qualities that were once admired may now be seen in a harsh, distorted light. The decisive friend's assertiveness is now seen as arrogance. The partner's individuality is interpreted as selfishness. The admired figure's boundaries are viewed as coldness. The shift happens because the mind moves from one extreme, idealization, to another, devaluation. It struggles to integrate complexity, so instead of seeing both strengths and flaws together, it flips the narrative entirely. This psychological pattern is particularly intense in emotionally charged relationships. The deeper the idealization, the more painful its collapse. People who were once adored become targets of resentment, not because they did anything extraordinary, but because they failed to uphold an impossible standard. The collapse feels personal, as if the admired person has betrayed an unspoken promise to remain perfect. But that promise never truly existed. It was created by the admirer's unconscious needs. This is why the reaction can be so emotionally charged. It's not only about the other person, but about the shattering of an inner fantasy that once provided security or inspiration. The collapse of idealization can also expose hidden envy and insecurity. When someone is idealized, they occupy a higher psychological position in the admirer's mind. They represent something greater, something to aspire to. But once the illusion breaks, the admirer may feel threatened by their own envy or disappointed by their inability to match that ideal themselves. Instead of acknowledging these vulnerable emotions, they might turn to criticism, hostility, or emotional withdrawal. The person who was once seen as the light now becomes the disappointment, and the psychological fall from pedestal to ground is often steep and harsh. Another layer to this dynamic involves projection. Idealization often occurs because people project their own unrecognized qualities onto others. They see in someone else what they have not yet claimed within themselves. For instance, someone who denies their inner strength may idealize a strong figure. Someone who has buried their creativity may idolize an artist. In truth, the qualities admired in the other person often exist, at least in potential, within the admirer. But when the illusion collapses, the projection is withdrawn, leaving a void that can feel destabilizing. Instead of looking inward to reclaim those projected qualities, many direct their frustration outward toward the one they idealized. The collapse of idealization is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle. A gradual cooling of enthusiasm, a quiet distancing, a growing sense of disillusionment. A person might not even consciously realize what is happening. They simply begin to feel different. What once inspired them now irritates them. What once felt safe now feels threatening or dull. This internal shift can be confusing both for them and for the person on the receiving end of their changing behavior. The relationship dynamic transforms, often without clear explanation, leaving behind emotional residue that neither side fully understands. In some cases, people attempt to maintain the illusion even as cracks appear. They ignore signs, justify behavior, or cling to the fantasy out of fear of losing the comfort it provides. But illusions, no matter how cherished, cannot withstand reality forever. Eventually, the tension between fantasy and truth becomes too great and the pedestal breaks. When it does, the emotional fallout can be intense. Some respond with bitterness, others with withdrawal, and some with silent resentment. The intensity of their reaction reflects not just their feelings about the other person, but the collapse of a psychological structure they depended on to make sense of their world and their emotions. There are battles that happen in plain sight, fought with words, actions, and clear intentions. And then there are battles that unfold quietly beneath the surface of polite conversations, shared laughter, and everyday interactions. These are the battles of the psyche, the invisible struggles between who people are and who they pretend to be, between their authentic selves and the identities they've constructed to survive. This is the silent war of inner conflicts, and its effects can be just as devastating as any open confrontation. Often, what appears as sudden hatred, resentment, or coldness from others is not really about you at all. It's the external echo of their internal wars. Every person carries within them a collection of unresolved contradictions. These are not necessarily signs of weakness. They are part of the human experience. A person can desire closeness, yet fear vulnerability. They can admire someone's strength while simultaneously resenting it. They can crave change, but cling to familiarity. These conflicting desires and fears often coexist without being consciously recognized. The conscious mind tries to maintain a coherent self-image, but beneath it, the unconscious simmers with tensions that haven't been faced. Over time, these tensions build pressure like fault lines beneath the earth, and it only takes a small trigger for the internal friction to manifest outwardly. This silent war is often most intense in individuals who have spent years building psychological masks. A mask is not simply a lie, it's a survival strategy, a role adopted to navigate the world. Some wear masks of strength to hide their insecurities. Others adopt masks of indifference to shield themselves from emotional pain. Some craft masks of perfection to escape criticism or rejection. The longer someone wears a mask, the more they begin to confuse it with their true self, forgetting that beneath it lies unresolved emotions, unmet needs, and buried fears. When they encounter someone whose presence disrupts the stability of that mask, their inner conflicts become activated. Imagine someone who has constructed an identity around being emotionally unshakable. They pride themselves on their stoicism, on never letting anyone see their vulnerabilities. Then they meet someone who embodies emotional authenticity, someone who is unafraid to express their feelings openly and honestly. On the surface, they might admire this trait, but beneath the surface, their inner conflict awakens. The part of them that yearns for authenticity recognizes itself in the other person, while the part that fears vulnerability feels threatened. This creates an internal clash, and because facing it directly is uncomfortable, the tension often gets projected outward as irritation, criticism, or sudden emotional withdrawal. The silent war of inner conflicts is also fueled by the gap between personal ideals and lived reality. People carry images of who they believe they should be: strong, kind, successful, wise. But their actual behaviors, thoughts, or feelings often fall short of these ideals. Instead of confronting this gap with honesty, many people push these uncomfortable truths into the unconscious, where they continue to exert influence. When someone else appears to embody those very ideals effortlessly, the internal tension grows sharper. The person feels an unspoken comparison between their authentic self and their idealized self, and the presence of the other person intensifies this inner dissonance. This can be seen in subtle relational dynamics. Someone might admire a friend's confidence, but simultaneously feel inadequate around them. They might value honesty, but become defensive when someone speaks truthfully. They might crave freedom, yet resent those who live boldly. These mixed feelings are not evidence of insincerity, but of unresolved inner struggles. However, if left unexamined, these struggles can quietly erode trust and connection. Instead of saying, "This person's presence makes me aware of something unresolved in myself," the mind finds more comfortable narratives. They're arrogant. They're trying to show off. They've changed. These stories mask the deeper reality of internal conflict. Another dimension of this silent war involves moral and emotional contradictions. People often hold values that conflict with their desires. Someone may value loyalty but secretly long for independence. Another might preach kindness while harboring resentment. These contradictions are uncomfortable to acknowledge, so they're pushed aside, creating a fractured inner world. When they encounter someone who embodies the values they've neglected or the desires they've suppressed, these fractures become more visible. Instead of confronting their discomfort, they may distance themselves, criticize, or even turn hostile, projecting their unresolved battle onto the person who unknowingly triggered it. This inner war is not always conscious. In fact, most of the time, people don't even realize the source of their changing feelings. They might experience sudden dislike, jealousy, or mistrust towards someone without understanding why. These emotions feel real and justified, but they are often emotional smoke signals from deeper psychological fires. The person becomes a symbol, a trigger, a mirror for internal struggles that have long remained hidden. What seems like a personal conflict is often just the surface expression of a much older and more private battle. Because these conflicts are silent, they can be particularly destabilizing. They don't follow clear timelines or logical patterns. One day, everything seems fine. The next, there's a coldness you can't explain. The person may not even be able to articulate what changed. The truth is, nothing external had to change. The trigger might simply have illuminated a part of their inner landscape they were trying not to see. These moments are often accompanied by defensiveness, irritability, or subtle forms of sabotage, as the person unconsciously attempts to silence the discomfort rather than face it. Social masks make this war even more difficult to detect. Many people have mastered the art of maintaining appearances while battling storms within. They smile while feeling threatened, praise while harboring resentment, support while envying. This creates confusing dynamics where the external behavior doesn't match the underlying emotional reality. To the observer, the shift can feel sudden and inexplicable, but to the person experiencing it, it's a way to manage unbearable internal contradictions. They are fighting themselves, and you just happen to stand at the fault line where their inner worlds collide. The silent war of inner conflicts explains why some of the most intense emotional reactions occur in relationships that seem stable on the surface. The tension is not caused by direct actions, but by psychological triggers that awaken dormant struggles. These triggers act like mirrors, reflecting back unresolved parts of the self. And because looking inward is often more painful than projecting outward, many people choose the latter. The hostility, envy, or distance that follows is often less about the external relationship and more about the internal battlefield they are trying to avoid confronting. Control is one of the deep psychological needs humans carry, often hidden beneath layers of personality, habit, and desire. From childhood, people learn that control provides safety. Being able to predict outcomes, influence situations, or maintain authority offers a sense of stability in a world that is inherently uncertain. Over time, this need for control weaves itself into relationships, identities, and social structures. But when someone begins to grow, change, or step into their personal power, this balance can shift, threatening the control others have learned to rely on. The fear of losing control can silently transform admiration into resentment, closeness into tension, and love into hostility without a single overt confrontation. At the heart of this fear is vulnerability. Control acts like a psychological shield, protecting people from unpredictability and the emotional discomfort that comes with it. In relationships, whether friendships, romantic connections, or family dynamics, control can manifest in subtle ways. It might look like being the advisor whose opinion is always sought, the caretaker who others depend on, the dominant voice in conversations, or the emotional anchor of the group. These roles provide a sense of relevance and security. But when someone within that dynamic begins to change, gaining independence, confidence, or new perspectives, it disrupts the unspoken hierarchy. What was once stable begins to feel uncertain. Consider a friendship where one person has always been the strong one, offering guidance and protection. Over the years, this role becomes part of their identity. But as the other friend evolves, becoming more self-assured and less dependent, the dynamic shifts. The strong one may unconsciously experience this as a threat, not because they want to hold the other person back, but because their sense of control, and by extension, their sense of importance, is being challenged. They might not say it aloud, but internally, they feel the ground beneath their role starting to move. This triggers an emotional reaction rooted in fear, fear of irrelevance, fear of losing influence, fear of not being needed. The fear of losing control often hides beneath rationalizations. A parent may say, "I'm just worried about your choices," when what they truly feel is a loss of authority as their child becomes independent. A mentor might criticize a protege's new ideas, masking their discomfort with a facade of concern for quality. A friend may subtly undermine another's confidence, cloaking it in humor or advice, while internally struggling with the loss of their position as the more dominant figure. These behaviors are rarely intentional acts of sabotage. They are protective reflexes triggered by the subconscious recognition that the power dynamic is shifting in a way that makes them feel unsafe psychologically. Control is closely tied to identity. People don't just hold power, they become the roles that give them power. A teacher who loses influence over their students might question their worth. A leader who is no longer followed may feel their sense of self disintegrating. A partner who once felt indispensable may begin to feel invisible. When someone else's growth triggers these insecurities, it's not simply about the practical loss of control, but about the existential fear of not knowing who they are without it. The other person's evolution unintentionally destabilizes their internal structure, awakening fears that may have been dormant for years. This fear can manifest in subtle but powerful ways. One common response is resistance to change. When someone close begins to evolve, the controlling individual might try to preserve the status quo through criticism, guilt, or emotional withdrawal. They may highlight flaws, question decisions, or bring up the past to keep the dynamic familiar. Another response is emotional distancing. Rather than confront their discomfort, they may slowly withdraw, convincing themselves that the relationship has changed, when in reality it's their control that has weakened. In some cases, this fear even takes the form of quiet hostility as the person projects their discomfort onto the evolving individual, interpreting their growth as arrogance, rebellion, or betrayal. The fear of losing control also activates unconscious power dynamics that often remain unspoken. Many relationships are built around unacknowledged hierarchies. One person leading, the other following, one providing, the other receiving, one influencing, the other adapting. When these hierarchies are disrupted, it can feel like the foundation of the relationship itself is cracking. The controlling person may not consciously think, "I'm losing control," but they feel it deeply, often as anxiety, irritation, or confusion. Their behavior shifts not because they've rationally decided to oppose change, but because their psyche is reacting to a perceived threat to stability. This dynamic becomes particularly intense in environments where identity and control are intertwined, such as families, workplaces, or long-term friendships. In families, parents who have built their sense of worth around their role as protectors may struggle profoundly when their children no longer rely on them. In workplaces, leaders who derived confidence from their authority may feel threatened by rising talent or fresh ideas. In friendships, those who have always been the advisor or emotional anchor may find it unsettling when their friend starts setting boundaries or making independent decisions. Each of these scenarios awakens the same underlying fear. If I'm no longer in control, who am I in this relationship? Another subtle aspect of this fear is that it often masks deeper insecurities. Control offers a way to hide personal fears of inadequacy. As long as someone feels in charge, they can avoid confronting their own vulnerabilities. But when control slips away, those buried insecurities surface. The other person's growth inadvertently exposes what has been hidden. Feelings of not being enough, of being replaceable, of losing significance. These emotions are difficult to face, so the mind may externalize them, blaming the other person for changing or creating distance, rather than acknowledging the fear within. The fear of losing control doesn't always lead to overt conflict. Sometimes it results in quiet tension. The person experiencing it might become more passive, aggressive, more judgmental, or simply less warm. They may not fully understand why they feel unsettled, only that something about the other person's new behavior threatens their psychological equilibrium. The evolving individual, on the other hand, may sense this tension, but find no logical explanation for it. What they're witnessing is not a direct reaction to their actions, but an indirect manifestation of someone else's internal struggle with shifting dynamics. Control, when threatened, exposes how much of people's emotional stability depends on maintaining predictable roles. When those roles change, even if the change is healthy and necessary, it can stir powerful unconscious reactions. Growth independence or boundary setting from one person can act as a mirror reflecting the other's insecurities about relevance and identity. In this way, the fear of losing control is less about external circumstances and more about the internal structures people build to feel safe in a world that constantly evolves